That is a booking.
No, no, but you can look at Liverpool's front three today. I look at Firmino when he first
What do
come
you
to...
mean it's a case of sticking with him?
I look at Firmino when he first come to England, Salah when he was first at Chelsea. They're not going to come off the bike
next
with...
3 years,
they're not
they're
going to come off with him.
settle with James and Rashford as a main striker.
No, but what I'm saying to you, you can't.
When Steve Nicol said he was nuts, he wasn't joking. He called Graham Souness the best leader of men he ever played under and the first person you'd want beside you in a fight. That wasn't a compliment you'd give lightly in the 1980s, when football was less a sport and more a war zone. This is the story of how Souness became the most terrifying figure in British football, told through the eyes of 8 legends who witnessed it firsthand. From punching opponents in front of 80,000 fans to fighting his own players in training, Souness built a reputation that still echoes today, made him so feared even by his own teammates. Jamie Carragher once said something that explains everything about Souness. He said the Scottish midfielder had everything and was probably more like Roy Keane and Glenn Hoddle rolled into one. Think about that for a second. Hoddle was pure silk, a technical genius who could split defences with a single pass. Keane was pure fire, a warrior who'd run through brick walls to win. Souness was both. He could deliver a hat-trick of missiles in a European Cup quarter-final, chip a delicate pass for a winning goal, but he could also break your jaw with a punch or leave you on a stretcher with a tackle that defied belief. That combination made him uniquely terrifying. You couldn't just avoid him physically because he'd embarrass you with his skill. You couldn't just respect his talent because he might hospitalise you. He was the complete package, and that's what made grown men afraid. The National Football Museum said his fearless commitment sometimes disguised a player of touch, vision and ability. Sometimes disguised. That's the key phrase. Souness didn't just hurt people randomly, he was strategic about it. His violence was psychological warfare. When opponents saw him on the team sheet, they knew they were in for 90 minutes of hell. When his own teammates saw him in training, they knew the standard they had to meet. Roy Keane himself admitted Souness was a massive influence on him. Keane said he watched Souness growing up, thought he was a brilliant player, and that Souness always had that influence on the way he played. Keane added that Souness thinks along the same lines as him. That's not just respect. That's Keane admitting that Souness was the blueprint. Every intimidating midfielder who came after Souness was copying his homework. When Souness arrived at Liverpool in January 1978, he wasn't walking into a friendly environment. He was joining the reigning European champions, a dressing room full of legends who had their own brutal code. At the top of that food chain was Tommy Smith, the Anfield Iron. Bill Shankly once said Smith wasn't born, he was quarried. Smith was the kind of player who'd end your career and not lose a second of sleep over it. Souness showed up with a perm and a moustache, looking like a champagne Charlie. On his first morning, he asked Smith if he could borrow his hairdryer. Smith looked at Phil Neal and said everyone is allowed to make one mistake. Smith thought Souness was soft. He was wrong. The moment that changed everything happened on the training ground. Howard Gale, Liverpool's first black player, was being targeted by Smith with racist abuse. Smith seemed bitter that his career was ending and took it out on Gale. After one training session, Gale accidentally hit Smith with a ball. Smith unleashed a tirade of abuse, shouting black this and black that. The entire training ground went silent. Nobody said a word. Gale, who had endured enough, walked over and confronted Smith, threatening him. In that moment, Gale was completely alone. Then Graham Souness was the only one that came over. He put his arm around Gale and said, "Well done, Howard. Tommy deserved that." Gale called Souness a true leader and said he had balls of steel. This wasn't just standing up for a teammate. This was a direct challenge to the most feared man at Liverpool. Souness was telling the entire dressing room that he was now in charge. Smith never forgave him. Years later, when Souness became manager, he banned Smith from club areas. But in that moment on the training ground, Souness won. If you're enjoying this deep dive into football's most terrifying legend, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which moment you think defined Souness the most. Let's talk about how he turned that dominance into titles. Souness didn't rule alone. He formed a powerful alliance with fellow Scots Alan Hansen and Kenny Dalglish. Souness and Dalglish were the gobby ones who'd argue and debate. But it was Big Al Hansen who'd end every discussion with a shake of his head and a sharp comment that stopped everyone in their tracks. This was a sophisticated power structure. Souness brought the intensity and physical dominance. Hansen brought the intellectual authority. Together, they controlled everything. Case, himself a notorious hard case who was hated by Everton fans for tackles that ended careers, played alongside Souness in midfield. Case was no angel, but even he acknowledged Souness as one of the truly gifted players. Case said Souness was a man you'd definitely prefer playing with you rather than against you. That's the point. Souness's terror wasn't random. It protected his teammates. It gave Liverpool a shield that opponents couldn't break through. Steve Nicol joined Liverpool in 1981 and had to fight his way into a team full of intimidating characters. He watched Souness set the psychological standard every single day in training. For Nicol, Souness wasn't just scary. He was the ultimate leader. Nicol said if you're going into a fight, he's the first person you'd want beside you. You're going into a football match, he's the first person you'd want beside you. That's the highest praise one footballer can give another. Souness's authority was absolute because it was earned. He didn't just talk tough, he backed it up every single day. His teammates were in awe of him because they knew he'd never ask them to do something he wouldn't do himself. That's why Nicol called him the best leader of men he ever played under. Now let's talk about the violence. Souness played in an era when football was brutal. The 1970s and 80s in England were defined by hooliganism, known as the British disease. The terraces were war zones, and the pitch reflected that chaos. Players could literally break someone's legs and stay on the field. Tackles that would earn a season-long ban today were just bookings back then. Souness wasn't just a product of that environment. He was one of its most ruthless masters. His rap sheet reads like a crime report, and each incident built his legend. Player-manager debut for Rangers in August 1986 set the tone for everything that followed. In a match against Hibernian, Souness was sent off for a stud-raking assault on George McCluskey. McCluskey said Souness sliced his leg open. The challenge sparked a mass brawl. But here's the twist. McCluskey later said in his book that Souness was not a hard man. For someone like McCluskey, a hard man operated within an unwritten code. They'd hurt you, were rules. Souness didn't follow those rules. His tackle wasn't hard, it was dirty. It crossed lines that even other enforcers wouldn't cross. That unpredictability was a weapon. Opponents never knew what Souness would do next, and that made him terrifying. The most infamous incident came in 1984 during a European Cup semi-final first leg. Liverpool faced Dinamo Bucharest in a match that was exceptionally violent. Souness claimed their captain, Lika Movila, was the worst of the lot, kicking everything that moved and punching him 3 times off the ball. Souness's retaliation was swift and brutal. He delivered an off-camera punch that broke Movila's jaw. Souness's recollection was chilling. He said it was the best punch of my life. He admitted he felt nothing at all as Movila was carried from the pitch. But the real test came in the return leg in Bucharest. Souness was a marked man. Romanian soldiers made throat-cutting gestures at him as he arrived. 50,000 fans booed him with every touch in the warm-up. He was relentlessly fouled throughout the match. His socks were in shreds, and one shin pad was split from top to bottom. Souness stood firm and delivered an outstanding man of the match display, setting up Ian Rush's opening goal to silence the stadium. That's what separated him from everyone else. He could dish it out, but he could also take it. His terror was backed by genuine physical courage. The tackle that cemented his reputation came in 1988, when Rangers faced Steaua Bucharest in the European Cup. Souness committed what was described as one of the worst tackles in football history. It was a horrific studs-up, knee-high lunge on Gheorghe Rotariu. Rotariu's teammate Gheorghe Popescu said Souness nearly killed him. Another Romanian legend, Iosif Rotariu, later said the tackle could have been in danger of ending his life. This wasn't a 50-50 challenge. It was a calculated act of extreme violence that broadcast his reputation across the entire continent. Opponents knew what was coming, but they couldn't stop it. When Souness became player-manager of Rangers in April 1986, his on-field aggression and off-field authority merged into one dominant persona. His arrival was the catalyst for a revolution. He used the ban on English clubs from Europe to lure top-tier English talent north, including Terry Butcher. Butcher was an England captain and an icon of physical commitment himself. He experienced Souness as both a rival and a leader, and his stories reveal a man driven by an absolute winning mentality. After Rangers lost the 1989 Scottish Cup final, Souness threw his medal in the bath. He told the kitman who retrieved it that he didn't take losers' medals. Butcher also saw Souness's temper firsthand. After Souness's debut red card for the foul on McCluskey, Butcher said Souness was fizzing, really angry. Despite the volatile atmosphere, Souness insisted on going out in the capital, forcing Butcher to come along as his minder. This showed Butcher that Souness's confrontational nature wasn't an act. It was who he was 24/7. The most legendary tales of Souness's management come from Ali McCoist, the club's prolific striker. McCoist's stories paint a picture of a training ground that was a deliberately cultivated combat zone. Souness had signed so many Englishmen like Butcher, Chris Woods and Graham Roberts that he could stage 5-a-side training games split by nationality. England versus Scotland. McCoist said Souness, despite being a proud Scot, would controversially play for the English team. The reason was simple: to drive us mental. He wanted to make his Scottish players angry. He wanted them to hate him in that moment so they'd fight harder. It was psychological manipulation at its finest. The defining story from those training sessions involves Ian Durrant. During one England versus Scotland game, the Scottish team was taking the mickey, playing with and all that stuff. Souness was boiling. The ball came to Durrant, a young, gifted Scottish player, and Souness, his manager, smashed him. Durrant got back up, put his foot on the ball, looked at Souness and said, "Souness, roaring," replied "No, Ian. It's not sun, as a matter of fact this is." Then bang, he punched Durrant in the chin. All hell broke loose. McCoist said we were all into it. A good old-fashioned scrap. McCoist himself was flying into it, trying to get a punch at Souness. The players sat in the dressing room afterward, battered and bruised. McCoist had a big fillet steak over his eye. They were thinking, what's he going to say? Fighting the day before a game, he's going to be raging. Souness walked in, surveyed the room and said, "That's exactly the spirit I'm looking for. That anecdote is the key to understanding Souness." The terrifying atmosphere wasn't a flaw, it was strategy. Souness weaponized conflict. Brawl wasn't chaos. It was a successful implementation of his philosophy. He believed this spirit, this internal physical conflict, was what forged winners. By playing for the England team, he cast himself as the villain, a target to unite his Scottish players against. He manufactured chaos to build a team of warriors in his own image. Souness's persona didn't fade when his playing days ended. It stayed with him into management and beyond. The most infamous example came when he was manager of Galatasaray in Turkey. Months after Souness had undergone open heart surgery, a vice president of their arch rivals, Fenerbahce, publicly mocked him, asking, "What are Galatasaray doing signing a cripple?" In 1996, Souness's Galatasaray won the Turkish Cup final, which concluded at Fenerbahce's stadium. After the final whistle, Souness was handed a giant Galatasaray flag. He looked up at the emptying stands, saw the director who had insulted him, and thought, "I'll show you who's a cripple." He marched onto the pitch, ran to the centre circle, and planted the flag deep into his rival's turf. The act nearly sparked a full-scale riot. Fenerbahce fans were trying to get onto the pitch. Souness had to be escorted to the tunnel by riot police. He later admitted, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. The act immortalised him. To Galatasaray fans, he became a legend known as Ulubatli Souness, after a Turkish hero who planted a flag during the conquest of Constantinople. Even after heart surgery, even knowing the danger, Souness couldn't help himself. Terrifying nature was who he was. The 8 legends we've discussed all described the same man. Tommy Smith saw him as a true leader with balls of steel who would confront anyone, even the Anfield Iron himself. Alan Hansen saw his intense leadership balanced by intellectual authority. Jimmy Case, a fellow enforcer, acknowledged him as one of the gifted players and a man you'd prefer playing with you rather than against you. Steve Nicol called him the best leader of men he ever played under and the first person you'd want beside you in a fight or a football match. Terry Butcher witnessed his absolute winning mentality that impressed even other hard men. Ally McCoist saw him deliberately manufacture conflict, punching his own player and then praising the brawl. Roy Keane validated him as a personal influence. saying Souness always had that impact on the way he played. And Jamie Carragher provided the ultimate verdict, calling him Roy Keane, and Glenn Hoddle rolled into one. Souness's toughness set the standard for future generations. Every midfielder who came after him borrowed from his playbook. His flaws were real. As a manager at Liverpool, he tried to change the culture too fast, confronting his former teammates and alienating the dressing room. Carragher was right when he said it was Souness, not Sir Alex Ferguson, who knocked Liverpool off the top. Those flaws were products of the same personality that made him great as a player. He couldn't turn it off. He couldn't compromise. Do you think football still has room for players like Graeme Souness? It's faster, more technical, and far less violent. But there's something missing. That raw edge, that fear factor, that sense that anything could happen. Souness represented an era when football was played by warriors, not athletes. He remains football's original Hardman, the archetype of the midfield general. The terrifying aura his contemporaries described was real. It was calculated, and for a golden, brutal period, it was the most dominant force in the game. Let us know in the comments what you think, and if you love stories about the legends who shaped football, make sure to subscribe. Graeme Souness may be a grumpy pundit now, but once upon a time, he was the man everyone feared, and that legacy will never die.
It was one of the worst times of my life. This is it. I don't want football anymore. It is a tragedy, but we're going to help each other. And it did. It helped tremendously.
He'll be welcomed in. It's not a team. It is a family.
He made me want to retire. That's what Ian Rush said about Bruce Grobbelaar. Not an opponent, not a rival manager, his own teammate, the man standing behind him, meant to be protecting the same goal. To fans watching from the Kop, Grobbelaar was the clown prince of Anfield, the mad goalkeeper doing handstands during matches, the entertainer with spaghetti legs who broke Roma's hearts in 1984. But inside that dressing room, behind the jokes and the gymnastics, lurked something far darker. A man whose threshold for violence wasn't learned on a football pitch. It was forged in the killing fields of Zimbabwe, where hesitation meant death, where it was you or them. And when Steve McManaman made a mistake in 1993, Grobbelaar grabbed him by the throat on live television. This wasn't motivation. This was war. Bruce Grobbelaar didn't grow up dreaming of Wembley. He grew up being conscripted into the Rhodesian army during the Bush War. While his future teammates were learning to pass and move in British academies, Grobbelaar was learning to kill. He served as a tracker, small groups, airlifted into direct contact with the enemy. He spent Christmas being mortared by freedom fighters, turning shelters into bunkers with sandbags. He watched two fellow soldiers kill themselves in adjoining toilets when they were told they had to return for another tour. They couldn't face going back. Grobbelaar understood why. He admitted years later that he wondered during dark periods if it would be better to place a gun in his mouth and shoot his brains out, but he rejected that as the action of a coward. The war taught Grobbelaar a philosophy that would define his entire football career. To survive, you have to act first. It's you or them. This wasn't metaphor. This was literal survival strategy. In the bush, hesitation got you killed. You saw movement. You acted. No second guessing. No committee meetings. Just instant violent response. That mindset didn't vanish when he swapped camouflage for goalkeeper gloves. It couldn't. The trauma was too deep. The rewiring too complete. So when Jim Beglin miscommunicated during the 1986 FA Cup final, Grobbelaar didn't see a teammate making an error. He saw a breach in the defensive perimeter, a failure that threatened survival. His reaction wasn't sporting disappointment. It was combat rage. The pressures of football meant nothing to Grobbelaar. How could they? He'd been in firefights. He'd killed to survive. He described it with chilling pragmatism years later. It's me or them. A penalty shootout at Wembley. A hostile crowd at Goodison Park. These were playground games compared to the bush. But this created a twisted paradox. Because the stakes felt low to him, he needed football desperately. It was the only safe place where he could replicate that high adrenaline state. The pitch became his sanctuary from dark thoughts. His goal was sacred ground. And when teammates jeopardized it with errors, they weren't just risking a goal. They were disrupting the mechanism keeping his trauma at bay. The terrifying outbursts weren't calculated. They were defense mechanisms protecting his psychological survival. Before Liverpool, Grobbelaar played for Matabeleland Highlanders in Rhodesia, a predominantly black team where fans called him Jungleman. It was there he encountered something that would disturb his future British teammates even more than his military background. The club hero was a witch doctor. Before matches, the team was taken to a garden where a man dressed in leopard skin, feathers and beads performed rituals. Grobbelaar believed in these rituals, or at least the psychological edge they provided. Years later at Anfield, he urinated on the goalpost to break a curse he believed prevented Liverpool from winning the title. He claimed a witch doctor told him the curse would only lift if he urinated on all 4 posts. He managed 2 during a match and 2 later. Liverpool won the league afterward. To his teammates, this wasn't quirky, it was unsettling. They were sharing a pitch with a man who believed he was fighting spiritual warfare alongside the actual match. A man operating on a different plane of reality, combining military lethality with witch doctor mysticism. That's not eccentric. That's genuinely frightening. But Grobbelaar's terror didn't exist in a vacuum. He arrived at Liverpool in 1981 into a culture that cultivated fear as policy. The dressing room was ruled by the Scottish mafia, Kenny Dalglish, Graham Souness, Alan Hansen. Grobbelaar described them as mercilessly witty and unforgiving. They were gatekeepers of the Liverpool way, a philosophy demanding winning at all costs. Souness was the emperor of midfield, known for physical intimidation. Hansen used intellectual bullying. He would punish errors with silence, refusing to speak to Grobbelaar for a week after mistakes. This wasn't team building. This was psychological warfare designed to filter out weakness. Grobbelaar spoke candidly about how new players were at the mercy of senior pros. The bullying was incessant. New shoes, a new haircut, a new shirt. You'd hear about it. Every triviality became ammunition for systematic ego dismantling. Some players struggled. They worried every time they stepped onto the training pitch. The atmosphere was constant anxiety. You had to be mentally armoured before entering the building. Grobbelaar, with his military background, adapted faster than most. He transitioned from victim to enforcer. The soldier found a new unit, and units need discipline. They need fear. Ian Rush and Ronnie Whelan were young talents being targeted by the Scottish mafia. Grobbelaar saw them at risk of being mentally broken. His advice was explicit. Lads, you have to fight back. Give it back to them. Don't be scared. He warned them if they didn't reciprocate the aggression, they would crumble. And he'd seen men crumble. In war and after war, their experiences and what they'd seen had proven too much. This revealed Grobbelaar's role not just as bully, but as mentor in brutality. He understood Anfield was Darwinian. Only those who could withstand and dish out abuse would survive. By instructing Rush and Whelan to adopt a combat stance, he was teaching them bush survival skills adapted for a locker room, fight or die. The fact that Rush became the club's greatest goal scorer and Whelan became captain suggests this terrifying pedagogy was effective. But at what cost? The physicality often crossed from pranks into assault. After a toxic 4-4 draw with Everton, where boots were being thrown in the dressing room, Grobbelaar took a player, stuck his head under the bathwater and sat on him. He recounted this casually years later. No remorse, just matter-of-fact description of simulated drowning. For young players like McManaman or quiet professionals like Beglin, knowing their goalkeeper was capable of such unpredictable physical violence added genuine fear to their daily work. This wasn't hazing. This was workplace assault, normalised by winning. The 1986 FA Cup final against Everton was Liverpool's chance at a historic double. The stakes were immense, the pressure suffocating. In the 56th minute, trailing 1-0, a defensive mix-up occurred between Grobbelaar and left-back Jim Beglin. Beglin expected Grobbelaar to collect the ball. The communication broke down. Graham Sharp slid in. Grobbelaar made a desperate save to prevent disaster. Then he exploded. No reassurance, no calm gesture. He launched a furious verbal assault and physically shoved Beglin. They squared up, chest out, in a full and frank exchange. Beglin later admitted Grobbelaar said something derogatory he couldn't repeat. For a moment, he wanted to punch the goalkeeper back, but the power dynamic was clear. Even decades later, Beglin deferred to Grobbelaar's judgment. He noted that Grobbelaar would say he was right and Beglin was wrong. That's not respect. That's residual fear. Yet crucially, the dressing down worked. Beglin admitted the row got his juices flowing. The aggression shocked the team from lethargy. It signalled that standards were slipping and consequences would be personal and physical. Within minutes, Liverpool equalised through Rush. They won 3-1, securing the double. Grobbelaar's terror was functional, a high-stakes shock tactic resetting his defenders' focus. In the 1980s, this brutality built champions, but eras change, and what worked in 1986 would destroy the team by 1993. During a Merseyside derby at Goodison Park in September 1993, Liverpool were struggling struggling. A poor clearance by young winger Steve McManaman allowed Mark Ward to score for Everton. Grobbelaar, furious at the defensive lapse, began berating McManaman, but unlike Beglin, the 21-year-old argued back. This insubordination triggered Grobbelaar's act-first instinct. The 36-year-old goalkeeper grabbed McManaman by the face and throat, pushing him violently. On live television, McManaman pushed back before retreating, clearly intimidated but unwilling to be completely cowed. This was the symbolic clash of generations. The old guard believed in physical hierarchies, corporal punishment for errors, absolute deference to seniority. Grobbelaar was the last remnant of Scottish mafia culture, trying to enforce standards through fear in a team losing its identity. The new wave, the Spice Boys generation, was less willing to accept brutal bullying dynamics. The context matters. Under Graham Souness, Liverpool were crumbling. The discipline and boot-room structure were dissolving. Grobbelaar's violence wasn't calculated motivation anymore. It was impotent rage against the dying of the light. The team lost 2-0. McManaman's argument angered him further, leading to physical escalation. It was a soldier's reaction to a unit failing to follow orders under fire. But the unit wasn't listening anymore. The war was over. Only Grobbelaar didn't realise it yet. This is the paradox that defined Grobbelaar. To the world, he was the entertainer. The spaghetti legs wobbling in mock terror to distract penalty takers in the 1984 European Cup final. The goalkeeper walking on his hands during matches. Sitting on the crossbar, Steve Nicol called him one sandwich short of a picnic. But this perception of madness made his aggression more terrifying. A rational bully is predictable. An irrational one who urinates on goalposts and walks on his hands, yet possesses the physical strength and killing instinct of a soldier, is unstable. The Clown Prince persona allowed Grobbelaar to get away with behaviours that would have seen others disciplined. It provided veneer of character over what was effectively workplace violence. When Souness took over as manager, he attempted to modernise the club. He replaced traditional pre-match steak, eggs and chips with pasta and rice. Grobbelaar viewed this with disdain. He recounted how Ian Rush stopped scoring for 6 weeks after switching to pasta, so Rush demanded steak, egg and chips, and scored a hat-trick. This resistance to change highlighted his role as guardian of old, rougher ways. He was the enforcer of a dying code, defending it with the same ferocity he'd defended his life in the bush. Grobbelaar defended Liverpool's drinking culture fiercely. He described the fitness regime as carbs loading, which he defined as hops, malt and barley, with lots of water. It's called beer. This wasn't just preference, it was identity. When that culture was challenged, Grobbelaar fought back, because removing it meant admitting that everything he'd endured, everything he'd inflicted on others, might have been unnecessary, that the terror was optional. He couldn't accept that. No analysis of Grobbelaar is complete without acknowledging compounding trauma. Already carrying scars from the Bush War, he was present at 2 of football's greatest tragedies, Heysel and Hillsborough. At Hillsborough, he was the player closest to the Leppings Lane end, where 97 fans were crushed to death. The trauma of seeing faces pressed against the fence, begging for help, resonated with his war experiences. In the aftermath, he read the first reading at the memorial service. Teammates like Whelan and Nicol carried communion bread and wine. This shared trauma created bonds transcending the bullying. While he was terrifying, he was also a brother in arms. Nicol, despite calling him crazy, acknowledged this bond. The shared experience of death and tragedy likely intensified Grobbelaar's survivalist approach. Protecting the goal became synonymous with protecting life. Failure was catastrophic. This helps explain the disproportionate rage toward Beglin and McManaman. In Grobbelaar's world, breaches of the line led to disaster, to death. His aggression came from survival trauma and fear of failure, not just football culture. By the 1990s, that aggression wasn't building winners. It was breaking morale. McManaman's rebellion was the symbolic end of Grobbelaar's era of fear. What made Grobbelaar truly terrifying wasn't just the violence itself, it was the unpredictability. Craig Johnston worried every time he stepped onto the training pitch, never knowing what would trigger an outburst. Would it be new shoes, a bad pass, a haircut? The randomness was weaponized. Grobbelaar had learned in the bush that unpredictability kept enemies off balance. He applied the same logic to teammates. The bathroom incident after the Everton draw exemplifies this perfectly. Throwing boots was standard dressing room anger, but taking a teammate, forcing his head underwater, and and sitting on him. That's assault masquerading as team building. Grobbelaar never revealed which player suffered this treatment, perhaps because the victim was too frightened to speak up, or perhaps because in that culture, complaining would mark you as weak. The silence around the incident is as telling as the incident itself. Alan Hansen's week-long silent treatments added another layer. Physical violence is immediate. You see it coming or you don't. But psychological warfare is insidious. It burrows into your mind, makes you question everything. Grobbelaar experienced both forms from the Scottish mafia. He learned them, internalised them, then deployed them with military efficiency. The combination of Hansen's cold silence and Grobbelaar's hot rage created a psychological pincer movement. Teammates were caught between ice and fire. Neither option was comfortable. Both were designed to break you down, to rebuild you as something harder, something capable of winning European Cups, but also something damaged. Yet despite the trauma and violence, Grobbelaar helped mould club legends. Rush and Whelan became champions, partly because they learned to fight back. The 1986 FA Cup final was won partly because Beglin was shocked into focus. Liverpool's dominance in the 1980s was built on many foundations. Grobbelaar's constructive terror was undeniably one of them. He forced teammates to develop thick skin necessary to win European Cups. He taught psychological survival. He shocked complacency into excellence. For a decade, his methods worked. Teams feared Liverpool, but Liverpool's own players feared Grobbelaar. The transformation from victim to enforcer completed quickly. When Grobbelaar first arrived at Anfield alongside Steve Nicol and Craig Johnston, they were all at the mercy of senior pros, fresh meat for the Scottish mafia. But where others struggled to adapt, Grobbelaar thrived. His military background prepared him for hostile environments. He'd survived worse than Graham Souness's glare. He'd endured more than Alan Hansen's silent treatment. So he absorbed the punishment, studied it, then became its most enthusiastic distributor. Within months, he'd gone from target to archer. The bullied became the bully, because that's how these systems perpetuate. Victims who survive become perpetrators to prove they've overcome, to demonstrate they belong. Grobbelaar didn't just belong, he became essential to maintaining the culture of fear. By the Premier League era, the game was changing. Sports psychologists replaced sergeants. HR departments replaced hazing. The drinking culture was dying. Professionalism was rising. Grobbelaar's war-forged instincts, so effective in the First Division trenches, became liabilities. The assault on McManaman proved that fear, which once galvanised, had turned toxic. The Junglemen belonged to a different time, a rougher, more brutal football world where goalkeepers could grab teammates by the throat and call it leadership. Bruce Grobbelaar was essential to Liverpool's 1980s dominance. His 6 league titles, 3 FA Cups and European Cup were earned partly through brilliance between the posts, but also through cultivating an atmosphere where teammates feared failure more than opponents. He was a war-touched survivor in a football world, both inspiring and deeply unsettling, a man who brought the binary logic of combat to a game, treating every goal conceded as a casualty, every teammate as a soldier who had to be ready to die for the cause. The Clown Prince entertained the cop with handstands, but the Jungleman kept his own teammates in constant adrenaline-fueled anxiety, a state in which, for over a decade, they simply could not afford to lose. He made Ian Rush want to retire. He grabbed Steve McManaman by the throat. He shoved Jim Beglin during an FA Cup final. And Liverpool won. That's the uncomfortable truth. The terror worked. Until it didn't. Until the game moved on. And left Bruce Grobbelaar still fighting wars that ended decades ago, wondering why nobody followed his orders anymore.
Started, I suppose, pretty late from what the young boys do today. I mean, everybody knows now that kids are taken from 5, 6, 7, 8 into professional clubs. I was picked up by Birmingham City, just about to leave school. I had a couple of months left at school, 16 years of age.
He destroyed me. That's how Nigel Winterburn describes one of the 7 players he was absolutely terrified to face. When a man like Winterburn, so tough his teammates said he'd run through a brick outhouse, admits to being genuinely terrified, you know you're talking about genuinely special footballers. Winterburn spent 20 years at the very top of English football for Arsenal. He lined up at left back for the legendary back four, alongside Tony Adams, Steve Bold and Lee Dixon. These 4 men created a system so organised that they suffocated opponents with an offside trap. But 7 players managed to crack it. 7 players made Winterburn's job a nightmare. Today, we're exploring who they were and why they terrified him. To understand how frightening these 7 were, you need to grasp what Winterburn brought to the pitch. He wasn't your typical athletic marvel. At 5'8", he lacked the towering frame of a modern centre-back. His gift wasn't raw pace or athletic dominance. What Winterburn had was a steel-hard mentality, absolute positional perfection, and an engine that never quit for 90 minutes. His teammate David Seaman said Winterburn didn't look like a footballer in physique, but possessed an unshakable will to win and could run all day. Winterburn's game was built on control, understanding angles, knowing exactly where to stand and when to strike. In Arsenal's system, positioning was everything, so the players who terrified Winterburn weren't necessarily the strongest or fastest. They were the ones with specific weapons, speed, two-footedness, spatial intelligence, or unpredictability that could shatter this rigid structure. Let's start with the player Winterburn himself identifies as his arch-nemesis, Ryan Giggs. If Arsenal's defence was an immovable object, then Giggs was the irresistible force. Winterburn called Giggs his most consistent and difficult rival, and this wasn't just mere polite talk. The Welsh winger haunted him throughout his entire career. The rivalry between Arsenal and Manchester United defined the entire Premier League in the 1990s and early 2000s, and the battle between Winterburn and Giggs on the flank was the heart of it all. Winterburn described Giggs as a constant nightmare, and that word choice truly matters. A nightmare is recurring, inescapable, and leaves you feeling helpless. For a defender like Winterburn, who thrived on control and predictability, Giggs represented total loss of agency. The tactical problem was simple but devastating. Arsenal pushed their defensive line high up the pitch, squeezing the playing area to force attackers offside. But Giggs had one singular ability that broke this entire system: blistering, controlled acceleration. He could accelerate from a standing start instantly, which meant you couldn't get tight to him without being beaten. But if you stood off him, he'd turn and sprint into the space behind you. And it wasn't just one way. Giggs could beat a man on either side. He'd play as a traditional left footer down the line, but he'd also cut inside onto his right foot to shoot or combine with forwards. This forced Winterburn into a neutral stance, which left him slow to react in either direction. The moment that epitomizes the terror Giggs caused came in the 1999 FA Cup semi-final replay at Villa Park. With the score locked at 1-1 in extra time, Giggs collected the ball in his own half after a loose Arsenal pass. What happened next was pure magic wrapped in a nightmare for Winterburn. Giggs slalomed past Arsenal's midfielders, weaved through the defensive lines that Winterburn had spent a decade building, and smashed the ball home. Historical analysis suggests that goal did more than win a match. It damaged the collective psyche of the Arsenal defence. Winterburn admitted it haunts him, representing a moment when their collective strength was rendered useless by individual genius. And Giggs didn't just haunt Winterburn once. They faced each other year after year in title deciders, cup finals, and crucial league matches. The mental fatigue of knowing Giggs would be there, season after season, unrelenting and evolving, added psychological exhaustion on top of the physical challenge. Now let's discuss David Ginola. If Giggs broke the system with pace, Ginola broke it with geometry. Defending is a game of angles. A fullback dictates where attackers go by positioning correctly, showing them onto their weaker foot or toward the touchline. Ginola shattered this approach entirely. Winterburn identified him as famously difficult because he was completely two-footed. This ambidexterity removed the cornerstone of traditional defensive doctrine. There was no weak foot to show him onto. This created a tactical problem. If Winterburn positioned himself to block the cut inside, Ginola would shift to his left foot and drive down the flank to cross. If Winterburn blocked the cross, Ginola cut inside onto his right foot for dangerous areas where he could shoot. The only way to defend was square on, leaving him vulnerable to the nutmeg. Ginola was deceptively strong. At 5'8", Winterburn often found himself outmatched. He used his body to shield the ball effectively. For an aggressive tackler, Ginola was a tactical trap. One mistimed lunge meant a yellow card, forcing tentative play for the rest of the match. Winterburn faced Ginola during his peak years at Newcastle, under Kevin Keegan's entertainers, where he played with attacking freedom. Later at Tottenham, he roamed freely. His 1999 PFA Player of the Year award, the year Manchester United won the treble, speaks to the individual terror he caused, but the most sophisticated threat came from Gianfranco Zola. While Giggs and Ginola operated in the wing channels, Zola represented a harder-to-see threat. The little Italian maestro joined Chelsea in 1996 and brought continental attacking style that confounded English defences. Winterburn described Zola as a player who would pop up in spaces where defenders didn't want to go. These were the half spaces, zones between centre-backs and full-backs, and seams between defensive and midfield lines. Arsenal's back four was designed as a singular line. All four moved together. Zola's movement disrupted this. He'd drift between Winterburn and centre-backs, creating a zone of confusion. This forced a genuine decision crisis. If Winterburn followed inside, he'd narrow the defence and open the flank. If he held position, Zola turned and drove at exposed centre-backs. This ambiguity is a defender's nightmare. Winterburn thrived on structure, so Zola's phantom movement was impossible to pin down. What made Zola even harder to defend was his physical profile. He was diminutive, with an extremely low centre of gravity, which allowed him to turn on a sixpence, literally spinning away from danger in tight spaces. In a physical duel, Winterburn could use his strength to unsettle an opponent. But Zola didn't engage in physical duels. He used his agility to spin away from contact before it arrived. If Winterburn got too close, Zola would roll him. If he stood off, Zola would curl a pass or shot into the top corner. And beyond the physical threat, there was an intellectual one. Zola's inclusion on this list highlights Winterburn's respect for pure footballing intelligence. The terror here was cerebral, the fear of being outsmarted. Zola saw passes and angles that other players didn't, punishing the Arsenal defence for the slightest lapse in concentration. Then there's Kanchelskis, pure velocity. The Russian winger was the opposite of Zola's subtlety. His weapon was raw, terrifying speed. Winterburn admitted Kanchelskis' explosive speed made for a very long afternoon. The early 1990s Premier League was faster and more open. This suited Kanchelskis perfectly, a touchline winger with Olympic acceleration. Arsenal's defence was vulnerable to pace because they played a high offside trap. For Kanchelskis, this space was an invitation. He didn't need complex dribbling. He simply knocked the ball past Winterburn and won the foot race. Once past his shoulder, he was gone. Facing him required repeated maximal sprints. The long afternoon speaks to the physical toll of chasing a player who never tired. Now, Eric Cantona's presence on this list is fascinating because, as Winterburn explicitly states, he was not a winger. Cantona was a forward, a playmaker, a talisman. His inclusion speaks to his pervasive influence across the entire pitch and his ability to disrupt not just his direct marker, but the entire defensive unit. Cantona was one of the pioneers of dropping deep into the hole between midfield and defence, a movement that caused structural havoc for Arsenal's rigid 4-4-2 formation. When Cantona dropped deep, Arsenal's centre-backs faced a genuine choice. Follow him into midfield and leave a gap in defence, or hold the line and let him turn and potentially orchestrate play. If they held the line, responsibility often fell to the fullbacks like Winterburn to tuck inside and narrow the pitch to deny Cantona space. But by forcing Winterburn to tuck inside, Cantona created space on the flanks for wingers like Giggs or Kanchelskis. Winterburn highlighted this specific tactical headache perfectly. Cantona forced defenders to make a choice that usually resulted in being caught out of position. It was a lose-lose scenario orchestrated by the Frenchman, but the terror of Cantona was deeply psychological as well. Winterburn referenced his physical presence and aura. The rivalry between Arsenal and Manchester United in the early 1990s was violent and visceral. Cantona inherited and amplified this hostility. He played with palpable arrogance, collar up, chest out, that challenged the authority of the Arsenal defence. Winterburn, a renowned hard man, found in Cantona an opponent who could not be intimidated. Cantona's volatility was also a weapon. He'd receive red cards and show aggression, creating an atmosphere where you had to be aggressive enough to stop him, but one step too far could ignite a flashpoint. Paolo Di Canio represents something entirely different, the ultimate wild card. Winterburn faced Di Canio as an opponent at Sheffield Wednesday, but also played alongside him at West Ham United. This dual perspective gave Winterburn a comprehensive and terrifyingly clear view of his capabilities. Winterburn frequently cited Di Canio due to his sheer unpredictability. Defensive coaching is based on pattern recognition. Di Canio defied every pattern imaginable. He could execute techniques others wouldn't attempt. Volleys from 40 yards, Rabona crosses, or sudden stops that left defenders sliding past. A defender never knew if he was going to produce a moment of magic or a moment of madness. This uncertainty breeds anxiety. You cannot settle into a rhythm against such a player. Winterburn joined West Ham in 2000 and played there until 2003. During this entire period, Di Canio was the club's talisman and main creative force. Winterburn saw his genius in training every day, the way he could humiliate defenders with a shoulder drop or touch of flair. This insider knowledge reinforced the terror he'd felt facing him previously. He knew Di Canio was capable of things that were simply indefensible. For a disciplined professional like Winterburn, Di Canio represented the antithesis of his footballing philosophy, a player who could not be controlled, only endured. The final name on the list might surprise you, Cristiano Ronaldo. Winterburn retired in 2003, while Ronaldo made his Manchester United debut in August 2003. But Winterburn explicitly recalls facing a young Ronaldo when he was at West Ham, admitting he was absolutely terrified. This suggests they crossed paths in a pre-season friendly or non-competitive fixture. Winterburn's recollection was visceral and powerful. What terrified him about Ronaldo was not just skill, but what he represented. Winterburn admitted that seeing the teenager's relentless step-overs and speed made him realise the game was changing. Winterburn had spent his career defending against wingers who used body feints and changes of pace. Ronaldo introduced a new archetype, the hyper-athletic, technical showman who performed tricks at high velocity. The step-over wasn't just for show, it was a biomechanical weapon used to unbalance defenders while sprinting. Facing a physical specimen like Ronaldo, while in his late 30s, highlighted the decline in Winterburn's own physical attributes. The terror was the realisation that the tools he'd relied on for 20 years, positioning, grit, timing, were no longer sufficient against this new breed of super athlete. Ronaldo's inclusion is symbolic. He stands as the bookend to Winterburn's career. If Kanchelskis represented the raw speed of the early 1990s, Ronaldo represented the future. A future where fullbacks would need to be sprinters and technicians themselves to survive. Winterburn's admission of fear regarding Ronaldo was an acknowledgement that he was witnessing the dawn of an era he could no longer compete in. It was the perfect, if terrifying, signal that it was time to hang up the boots. These 7 players reveal something quite profound about football and about Winterburn himself. The common thread among them is their ability to strip a defender of control, whether through speed like Giggs and Kanchelskis, ambidexterity like Ginola, positioning like Zola and Cantona, or sheer unpredictability like Di Canio and Ronaldo. They forced Winterburn to react rather than dictate. For a defender whose reputation was built on composure, aggression, and tactical discipline, the terror stemmed from this loss of agency, this inability to control the narrative of the match. Ultimately, Winterburn's admission of fear is a testament to the truly exceptional quality of the era he played in. To have battled these 7 titans, each a genuine legend in their own right, and emerged as one of the most decorated and respected left-backs in English history, confirms something truly important. Yes, he may have been terrified, but he was rarely conquered. These opponents shaped him, challenged him, and, in the end, helped define his greatness. They are the nightmares that sharpened the skills of one of Arsenal's greatest ever servants. That's the real story here. Not that these players were brilliant, though they absolutely were, but that facing them year after year pushed Winterburn to be better, to be sharper, to be tougher, and that's what made him legendary. So if you've truly enjoyed learning about the 7 players who absolutely terrified one of football's greatest defenders, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories from football's greatest era, and leave a comment below telling us which of these 7 you would have most liked to see Winterburn face down. Thanks so much for watching.